So the YMCA in Australia has a very long, proud history. A YMCA representative is a person who is not part of the armed services. They are attached to the armed services. They hold honorary officer status, therefore they can live within the officers' mess, etc. But they also report to the YMCA structure and not to the military structure. YMCA reps therefore do not receive military awards, but they can receive civilian awards. And in the First World War, we had a person who was awarded the MBE. Going back to the Boer War, 1900, we had YMCA representatives going to South Africa. In fact, one of those representatives was Martin Madden, who wrote a diary, and I've got an original copy of his certified copy of his diary, and he tells the story there of when sailing with the Queensland Light Horse to South Africa, the problem they had with all the horses on board. Some of the horses were dying and they'd be thrown overboard, and the ship was being followed by sharks because they saw a natural food source coming their way from that ship. After the Boer War, the First World War happened, and the YMCA made a commitment to that. We had 394 representatives who served in both in home camps, in forward areas, and also at the front line. Remarkable stories have been coming out of the YMCA's involvement, especially in France in the First World War, because I've been able to receive photos recently of 100 years old of the YMCA burial party in France. This was a group of 5 YMCA representatives who were ministers of religion, and they saw the dead being buried in mass graves, and they decided to do something about it. They formed themselves into the burial party. In the local village there was an Australian lady, Miss Rout, who the Y reps, the burial party, worked in conjunction with, and she encouraged the village people to form themselves into the grave detachment unit, and they were the people who dug the graves, etc. And the burial party averaged 36 burials a day. Also, we had several representatives who were killed in France. We also had several representatives who were wounded. So when it is said that the YMCA probably only worked in base camps, we have plenty of evidence that the YMCA was at the front line, serving troops. Now, the role of a YMCA representative was to work as a recreational welfare worker. So therefore, in base camps or in home camps, they would be organising sporting activities, entertainment in the YMCA huts. They would use local people from local communities to come in as entertainment groups and provide entertainment to the troops. Yes, so they would organise even activity in forward areas. We then go through to the Second World War, and we had 436 representatives who served in the Second World War. Again, both in home camps, in forward areas, and also at the front line. The YMCA, especially in the Second World War, were much more mobile because they had a number of mobile canteens, vehicles, etc., which they were able to use. We also had mobile projection rooms where they could go from camp to camp showing films, etc. In the Second World War, we had 3 reps killed on duty. We had 3 died on duty. We had 4 who were prisoners of war in Changi. 4 were mentioned in dispatches. 3 were awarded the OBE, 2 were wounded on duty, and 5 returned home with poor health. During the Second World War, I made reference to the 4 representatives who were prisoners of Changi, which was a Japanese prison in Singapore. And one of those representatives wrote a diary of the activities which they were organising. The 4 representatives went to the commander of the Japanese prison to ask the commander could they carry on their work as representatives, pointing out they were not part of the army, but they were attached to the army. And this was granted. And the diary tells the story of their day-to-day activity of what they organised. With 10,000 prisoners, there was a huge amount of talent amongst those prisoners to be able to organise debating groups, entertainment, whatever. The diary does not talk about the conditions of Changi, because if the diary was discovered, they could have been shot. So it only talks about the YMCA work which they did, the welfare recreational work. There are a couple of interesting entries in the diary which I appreciated. One, first it pointed out that their ration was a cup of rice per day. This was for all the prisoners. And on this entry on the 14th of March 1943, it said that 4 of us tonight sat down to a delightful meal, which was roast cat. The diary explains the story all the way through and the magnificent work they did. The prisoners even built a hut out of what they could scramble for the YMCA. A chapel was built. The diary tells how the prisoners made sporting equipment. They made a cricket ball out of an old boot. One of the prisoners, who was a dentist, made some dental equipment so he could carry out dental work on some of the prisoners. So yeah, it tells this magnificent story. The other great story, it came out of the Second World War, was probably the work in Papua New Guinea, and the work which was done at the base of the Kokoda Trail. There was a YMCA tent there, and next door to the tent was a tent for where the wounded would have been brought down by the native porters, and they'd be placed in this tent, and the Y reps would be servicing the wounded while they were waiting to be picked up to be taken to a base camp or to a hospital or whatever for their wounds to be treated. Again, last year, someone sent to me from an unknown source a 100-page document written by Stanley Langdon, who is a YMCA commissioner. And it tells a wonderful story of the YMCA work in Northern Australia and the Pacific Islands. The work which the reps did. It gives a description in Darwin when Darwin was under threat of being bombed. And it tells a story how one day the drone of heavy aircraft was heard, and Darwin went into panic mode because they thought it was the Japanese attacking. It turned out to be the American Lancaster bombers escaping their base, which had just been bombed in Borneo, and they went to a secret air base out of Darwin. The only vehicle, non-military vehicle, which was allowed to go to that base was the YMCA mobile canteen to go and service the servicemen, their crews on those planes. Then the story goes on that again, a few days later, the drone was heard again, but this time it was the Japanese bombers coming in to attack mainly the Darwin harbour, because that's where shipping was, where ships were providing services to the troops further north. And it gives a description of the problems that occurred after that bombing and the work. Again, the YMCA not only working with the troops, but working with the civilian population in helping people in that. In my YMCA work as a historian, I get people making inquiries, and these diaries and reports, etc., are a valuable resource to go back and have a look at and to find out information. The YMCA has operated in Australia for many years and has served the community in many ways, and Defence Force workers has been one of those. We were also involved in the Korean conflict, and we had representatives serving in Korea and also in Vietnam. At the end of the the Second World War, there was the occupational forces of Japan, the British occupational forces, and which Australia, YMCA, along with the YWCA, served together in Japan until the area was made safe and the work discontinued and they returned home safely. So yes, I would say the YMCA has had a very proud record in Australia of its work it's done for Defence Forces. Also the work which is done in the communities, the broader work which has been, I think the YMCA first started in Adelaide in 1850. So then in Melbourne in 1953, Sydney was also 1953, and Hobart in 1954.